Listen close now. Children of the diaspora, down in the clay fields of Georgia, where cotton grows white as bone and the sun beats merciless as a master's rage, there lived a child named Emma. Just 10 summers old, but her eyes carried the weight of ancestors who crossed the great water in chains. They say when the overseer Harlan decided to make an example of her, the very earth trembled with the knowledge of what was coming. 55 days, folks. 55 days locked in darkness, salt burning in open wounds, forgotten by all except the spirits who keep watch over suffering souls. This ain't no tale from books, no sir. This here's memory, carved in scars, whispered in the quarters, and carried in the blood of those who survived to tell it. So come close, real close now, and let me pull back the veil on a suffering so deep, even hell itself would weep. Now listen here, child, for this is how it all started on that cursed morning in the summer of 1847, down on the Wexford plantation in the red clay country of Georgia, where the cotton fields stretched long as sorrow and twice as white. Emma woke before the bell, like she always did, in the dark quarters where folks slept packed tight as cargo in a ship's belly. The air hung thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, sickness, and yesterday's cornmeal mush gone sour. She was just a slip of a thing, 10 years old with skin dark as good Georgia earth, and eyes that still held some light the plantation hadn't beat out yet. Her mama had been sold south 2 summers back, down to the sugar fields of Louisiana where folks say you work till you drop dead. Her daddy, Lord have mercy, she barely remembered his face no more. Just the sound of chains when the slave traders took him to the auction block in Savannah when she was barely walking. The bell clanged harsh across the plantation grounds, metal on metal cutting through the pre-dawn quiet like a blade. Emma rolled off the hard ground where she slept, her thin cotton shift sticking to her small frame. Around her, the other slaves stirred, groaning low. Old Tia Ruth with her twisted hands from years picking cotton. Young Josiah, who sometimes snuck Emma extra cornbread when the overseer wasn't looking. And Big Moses, whose back was a map of scars from the whipping post. "Get on up now, children," Tia Ruth whispered, her voice rough as tree bark. "Don't give Massa Harlan no reason to start this day with the whip." Emma tied a rag around her head to keep the sun off, and followed the others out into the gray morning. The cotton fields waited, endless rows of white bowls ready for picking. The work was hard on grown folks, but it was pure hell on children. Emma's fingers were already scarred and calloused, bleeding most days by noon. Overseer Harlan sat high on his horse at the edge of the field, a mean-looking white man with a face like dried leather and eyes cold as January rain. He carried a whip coiled at his hip like a snake ready to strike, and folks said he'd rather beat a slave than eat breakfast. His reputation was known clear across 3 counties. Man of iron will and devil's heart, they called him. Cruel-hearted and full of fury, that one. "Y'all better make quota today," Harlan shouted, his voice cutting across the field. "Any nigger come up short gonna meet my friend here." He patted the whip, and Emma felt her stomach twist. "And I do mean any. Don't care if you're old, young, man, woman, or child. Cotton don't pick itself, and Massa Wexford expects his money." Emma took her sack and moved into the rows, her small hands reaching for the cotton bowls. The sun climbed higher, burning something terrible, turning the field into a skillet of heat. Sweat ran down her face, stinging her eyes. Her fingers moved quick as she could make them, plucking the white fiber from its sharp shell, dropping it in her sack. Around her, she could hear the work songs starting up low, the old ones singing to keep rhythm and keep hearts from breaking. "Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water." Emma hummed along soft, the melody giving her tired hands some strength. But her mind wandered as she worked, thinking on the stories Tia Ruth told about the North Star and freedom, about folks who ran and made it to places where Massa couldn't reach. In them days of deep sorrow, a child's dreams were dangerous things, but Emma couldn't help but dream. By midday, when the sun hung directly overhead like God's angry eye, Emma's sack was only half full. Her small hands just couldn't move as fast as the grown folks, and she knew it. Fear rose in her chest like floodwater, She looked around, desperate-like, saw Josiah working 2 rows over with his sack nearly full. "Josiah," she whispered urgent, when Harlan rode to the far end of the field. "Help me please, I ain't gonna make quota." Josiah was maybe 14, tall and strong-backed despite the hardship. He had kind eyes, and folks said he carried feelings for little Emma, protective-like. He glanced around quick, then dumped some of his cotton into her sack when nobody was looking. "Don't let him catch you short," Josiah warned low. "Harlan's been riled up all week. Master lost money on a bad crop sale, and you know when massa hurts, slaves bleed." But the devil must have been watching, because right then Harlan wheeled his horse around and came galloping back. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, swept over the field and landed on Emma, just as Josiah was pulling his hand back from her sack. "You there!" Harlan's voice cracked like thunder. "What in hell you think you're doing, boy?" Josiah straightened up, his face going stone-like the way slaves learned to do. "Nothing, sir. Just picking cotton like you said." "Don't lie to me, nigger. I got eyes." Harlan urged his horse closer, and Emma felt her heart beating like African drums in her chest. "You was helping that little pickaninny cheat her quota, wasn't you?" The field went quiet. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Folks kept their heads down, kept picking, but Emma knew they were all listening, all scared to death. "No, sir," Josiah said, but his voice wavered. Harlan dismounted, his boots hitting the red clay with heavy thuds. He walked over to Emma's sack, picked it up, weighed it in his hand. Then he dumped it all out on the ground, cotton scattering like snow in hell. "Start over," he said to Emma, his voice deadly calm. "And if you don't make quota by sundown, you gonna wish you was never born." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she knew better than to let them fall. She bent down and started gathering the cotton back up, her hands shaking. But something in her, maybe her mama's stubbornness, maybe her daddy's pride, maybe just the pure exhaustion of being 10 years old and worked like a mule, made her look up at Harlan. Just for a second, just one flash of her eyes meeting his. But it was enough. Harlan saw that look, that tiny spark of defiance, that moment when Emma's soul said this ain't right even though her mouth stayed shut. His face went red as Georgia clay, and Emma knew right then she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "You got something to say to me, girl?" Harlan asked, his voice soft now, dangerous soft. Emma dropped her eyes quick. "No, sir. I asked you a question. Look at me when I'm talking to you." Emma raised her eyes again, and this time she couldn't stop the hatred from showing, just for a heartbeat. Lord have mercy, she was just a child who didn't know how to hide her soul yet. Harlan's hand shot out and grabbed Emma by her thin arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "I think you need a lesson in respect," he said. "I think you need to learn what happens to niggers who think they can look at white men like they're equal." "Please, sir." Tia Ruth's voice came from nearby, trembling but brave. "She's just a child, sir. She didn't mean no harm." "Shut your mouth, old woman, unless you want some of what she's about to get." Harlan started dragging Emma toward the big barn at the edge of the field, the one where they stored equipment and where, folks whispered, bad things happened to slaves who stepped out of line. Emma's feet scrambled in the dirt, trying to keep up, trying not to fall. She heard Josiah start to move, heard Big Moses grab him and whisper harsh, "Don't be foolish, boy. You can't help her now." The other slaves kept picking, kept their heads down, but Emma could feel their eyes on her, feel their prayers rising up like smoke. The barn door stood open like a mouth ready to swallow her whole. Harlan dragged her inside where the air smelled of hay and leather and old blood. Dust motes danced in the strips of sunlight coming through the wall cracks. He shoved Emma forward and she fell hard on her knees. "Strip off that shirt," Harlan ordered. "Please, massa, I'm sorry. I didn't mean. I said strip it off." With shaking hands, Emma pulled off her thin cotton shirt, leaving her small back bare. She was just a child, just a baby, really. But slavery don't care about that. The whip don't distinguish between young and old. Harlan walked to the wall where the implements hung. Whips of different sizes, some with multiple tails, some with bits of metal worked into the leather. He selected one, a medium-sized whip that had tasted plenty of flesh before. He tested it in the air. Crack. And Emma flinched at the sound. "This is what happens," Harlan said, "to niggers who forget their place. You gonna remember this, girl. And everyone on this plantation gonna remember it too." He raised the whip high, and Emma squeezed her eyes shut, her lips moving in a prayer her mama taught her, words in a language from across the ocean that she didn't understand, but knew held power. The whip came down. The sound of leather hitting flesh echoed through the barn like a gunshot. Emma's scream tore from her throat, a sound so full of pain it seemed to shake the very walls. The whip split her skin clean open, blood welling up in a bright red line across her small back. "Count," Harlan ordered. "Count each one or I start over." "1," Emma sobbed. The whip fell again, and again, and again. By the 5th strike, her back was a mess of torn flesh, blood running down in streams that soaked into her skirt. By the 10th, she could barely speak the numbers. The barn spun around her, and she thought she might pass out, might escape into darkness where the pain couldn't reach. But Harlan wasn't done. Not nearly. When the whipping finally stopped, Emma had lost count somewhere around 15. She collapsed face first on the dirt floor, her back on fire with a pain so intense it didn't even feel real. She heard Harlan breathing hard from the exertion, heard him set down the whip. "Bring me the salt," he called to someone outside. Footsteps. Then a slave Emma didn't recognize came in carrying a burlap sack. Emma's mind was too foggy to wonder why, too lost in agony to care. Harlan opened the sack and Emma smelled it. Salt. Coarse salt. The kind they used to cure meat in the smokehouse. "Hold her down," Harlan ordered, and the other slave, terrified, unwilling, but more scared of Harlan than of God, pressed his hands on Emma's shoulders. Harlan took a handful of the salt and pressed it directly into the open wounds on Emma's back. The scream that came out of Emma wasn't human. It was the sound of every ancestor who'd suffered, every soul who'd been broken, every child who'd been destroyed by slavery's cruelty. The salt bit into the raw flesh like 1,000 tiny teeth, burning with a fire worse than any whip. Her body convulsed, trying to escape, but the hands held her down. Harlan rubbed the salt in methodically, covering every wound, making sure it sank deep into the torn skin. Emma's screams turned to whimpers, then to a thin, keening sound, then to nothing as her voice gave out entirely. When he was done, Harlan wiped his hands on his pants and stood up. "Take her to the root cellar," he said. "Lock her in. Nobody feeds her, nobody gives her water, nobody even looks at her unless I say so. 55 days, that's her sentence. 55 days to think about what happens when you look at a white man wrong." Emma's consciousness was slipping away, blessed darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision. She felt herself being lifted, carried. The last thing she remembered was the sound of a door closing, the scrape of a bolt sliding home, and then darkness, complete and absolute. In the cotton fields, the work songs had stopped. The quarters that night were silent as a grave, everyone too scared to speak, everyone knowing that something terrible had been born that day, something that would be remembered and whispered about for generations to come. And in the dark root cellar beneath the ground, Emma lay on cold dirt, her back still burning with salt and fire, beginning what would be the longest 55 days of her young life. The root cellar was a tomb for the living, a hole dug deep in the Georgia earth where Massa Wexford stored his potatoes and turnips through the winter. Now it held something more valuable and more disposable than vegetables. A child whose only crime was looking at a white man with human eyes. Emma woke to darkness so complete she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. The cold dirt beneath her pressed against her cheek, gritty and damp, smelling of rot and old earth. For a confused moment, she didn't remember where she was or what had happened. Then she tried to move. Lord have mercy, sweet Jesus. The pain that exploded across her back was like nothing she'd ever known, worse even than when the whip first fell. The salt had worked its way deep into the wounds, and every tiny movement made it burn fresh, like her flesh was being eaten by fire ants from the inside out. She tried to cry out, but her throat was raw from screaming. and all that came was a dry wheeze. The darkness pressed in on all sides. Emma could hear things moving in the cellar. Rats probably, or roaches, or worse things that lived in the deep places under the plantation. She tried to sit up, but the pain drove her back down. Her torn shirt was stuck to her back with dried blood and salt, and when she moved, it pulled at the wounds. "Mama," she whispered into the darkness. Though her mama was hundreds of miles away, probably dead in them Louisiana cane fields by now. "Mama, help me." But only silence answered. The kind of silence that speaks loud, the silence of abandonment, of being forgotten, of being left to suffer alone where nobody could hear you scream. Emma's fingers explored the space around her. Cold dirt floor, stone walls rough as tree bark, wooden shelves holding sacks of something, vegetables maybe, or grain. The ceiling so low she could touch it if she reached up, which she couldn't because raising her arms sent lightning bolts of agony through her shoulders and back. How long had she been here? Hours? Days? In the absolute darkness, time stretched and warped like hot iron. Her mouth was dry as cotton, her tongue thick and useless. The thirst was already starting, that desperate need for water that would only get worse as days passed. "Somebody," she tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Please, somebody help me." Nothing. Not a footstep, not a voice, not even the sound of work going on above. Just the scuttle of rats and her own ragged breathing. In the dark, Emma's mind started to wander, fever already creeping into her blood from the infected wounds. She saw her mama's face, the way it looked the day the slave traders came. Saw her daddy being led away in chains, his eyes finding hers across the auction block yard one last time. Heard the songs from the quarters at night, the spirituals that spoke in code about freedom and the North Star, and the underground railroad that could carry you away from all this suffering. Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. I ain't got long to stay here. The song whispered through her mind like a ghost, and Emma found herself humming it between cracked lips. Her mama used to sing it while braiding her hair, back when Emma still had a mama, back when the world was small enough to fit inside a cabin in the quarters and big enough to hold love. Time passed. Emma dozed and woke and dozed again, never sure which was which. The pain in her back became a living thing, a creature with teeth that gnawed constantly at her flesh. The salt kept burning, kept eating away at the raw wounds, and she could feel the skin getting hot and swollen, infection spreading like poison through her small body. When the fever took hold proper, Emma started seeing things in the darkness. Figures moving, shadows with eyes, ancestors walking through walls of stone and earth. An old woman with tribal marks on her face and beads in her hair spoke to her in a language Emma didn't know, but somehow understood. "Hold on, child. Your suffering has meaning. The ancestors are watching. But what meaning could there be in this? What purpose in a child locked in darkness with salt burning in her wounds?" Emma wanted to believe the vision, wanted to think the old ones were keeping watch. But mostly she just hurt so bad she wanted to die, wanted to give up her spirit and let it fly away to wherever spirits go when bodies become too broken to hold them. Up above, life on the plantation went on. Emma could hear it sometimes. Boots walking, horses passing, the distant sound of the work bell. The world continued without her, and nobody seemed to care that a 10-year-old girl was dying by inches in a hole in the ground. But that wasn't quite true. In the slave quarters that first night, folks spoke in hushed voices about what Harlan had done. "That man got no soul," Big Moses said, his deep voice heavy with anger he didn't dare show in daylight. "Putting salt in a child's wounds. Lord, what kind of devil does that?" "Hush now," Tia Ruth warned, her twisted hands shaking as she stirred the communal pot. "Walls got ears on plantations, you know that." Young Josiah sat in the corner, his head in his hands. "It's my fault," he said, voice breaking. "If I hadn't tried to help her with the cotton." "Ain't your fault, boy," Moses interrupted. "Ain't nobody's fault but that evil overseer and the system that made him. Slavery's the devil's own work, and we all just trying to survive it." "But 55 days," whispered a woman named Clara, who had 2 children of her own. 55 days in that dark hole with infected wounds. She won't survive that, no child could. The quarters fell silent. They all knew she was right. 55 days was a death sentence just delivered slow. Harlan knew it too. That was the point. He wanted Emma to suffer, wanted to make an example that would keep the other slaves terrified and obedient. "We got to do something," Josiah said, standing up sudden-like. "We got to help her." "And what you gonna do, boy?" Moses asked, not unkindly. "Harlan's watching that cellar like a hawk. Any slave caught going near it gonna end up in there with her, or worse." "I don't care," Josiah said. But his voice shook because he did care. He was terrified. But the thought of Emma suffering alone was worse than his fear. Tia Ruth reached out and took Josiah's hand with her gnarled fingers. "We gonna pray," she said firmly. "We gonna pray like our ancestors taught us. Pray to the old gods and the new. Pray for that child's soul. And when the time comes, when Harlan's guard slips even a little, then maybe we can help. But rushing in now just gonna get more folks hurt." They bowed their heads in the dim cabin, and Tia Ruth began to pray in a mix of English and words from across the ocean, calling on powers that had survived the Middle Passage, on spirits that remembered Africa, on the Christian God that the masters claimed but didn't follow, on any force in heaven or earth that might show mercy to a suffering child. Down in the cellar, Emma didn't hear the prayers, but maybe something heard them for her. Because even as the pain raged and the fever climbed and the darkness pressed in like a coffin, some small part of her spirit refused to break. Her heart beat like African drums, stubborn and strong, keeping rhythm with something ancient and undefeated. Days blurred together. Emma lost track of time entirely. The thirst became worse than the pain, her tongue swelling in her mouth until she could barely breathe around it. She tried to lick moisture from the damp walls, but it wasn't enough. Never enough. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but the thought of food made her sick. The wounds on her back festered. She could feel it happening, feel the heat radiating from the torn flesh, feel the pus forming. The salt had done its evil work, preventing the wounds from closing, keeping them raw and open and vulnerable to every bit of dirt and filth in the cellar. Her thin shift stuck to the infected skin and she didn't dare try to pull it free. On the 3rd day, or was it the 4th, Emma heard something above the cellar door. Footsteps, heavy boots. Her heart leaped with hope. Maybe someone was coming to let her out. Maybe Harlan had changed his mind. Maybe. The bolt scraped back. Light flooded in, blinding after so long in darkness. Emma couldn't see who stood there, could only make out a dark silhouette against the painful brightness. "Well, well," came Harlan's voice, cold and satisfied. "Still alive, I see. Good. Wouldn't want you dying too quick and missing the lesson." He climbed down the ladder, and Emma could see him now through squinted eyes. His face showed no pity, no remorse, nothing but cruel satisfaction. He walked over and grabbed Emma by the hair, forcing her to lift her head. "You look at me when I'm talking to you," he said. "Oh wait, you learned that lesson already, didn't you? But I want to make sure it sticks." He released her hair and her head fell back to the dirt. Emma heard him moving around the cellar, and then the sound that made her blood freeze. The unfurling of a whip. "No," she tried to say, but the word came out as a croak. "Please, no more. Oh, this ain't for you. Not today anyway." Harlan's boots came back into her limited view. "This is just to remind you what's waiting if you make any noise, if you cause any trouble, if you do anything but lie here quiet and think about your sin." He cracked the whip in the air, and the sound in the confined space was like a cannon blast. Emma's body jerked involuntarily, and the movement tore at her wounds, making fresh blood seep through the crusty scabs. 52 days left, Harlan said conversationally. 52 days of darkness and pain and wondering if today's the day you finally die. But you're a strong little pickaninny, ain't you? Your type usually is. Probably take all 55 days to break you proper. He climbed back up the ladder, and before he closed the door, he said one more thing. "Oh, and I'm posting a guard now. Anyone caught trying to help you, I'll give them the same treatment. 55 days, double portions of salt. You want your friends to suffer like you? Then call out. Go ahead, see who comes. The door slammed shut. The bolt scraped home. Darkness returned, heavier than before. Emma lay in the dirt and finally let herself cry. Not from the pain, though that was unbearable, but from the pure crushing loneliness of it. The knowledge that she was utterly alone, that calling for help would only bring suffering to others, that she had to endure this nightmare by herself. Her tears mixed with the dirt on her face, making mud. Somewhere in the darkness, a rat scurried across her legs, and she didn't even have the strength to kick it away. The fever burned hotter, and her mind started to slip again, drifting between waking nightmares and delirious dreams. She saw her ancestors on the slave ships, packed tight in the dark holds, dying of disease and despair. Felt their suffering echo through time to reach her. Saw conjure women with wise eyes and root doctors with medicine bags. Heard spirituals sung in languages that predated the plantation, that remembered when her people were free. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, troubles of the world, troubles of the world. Going home to live with God. The song wound through her delirium like a thread of light in the darkness. Emma held on to it, let it anchor her spirit even as her body broke down piece by piece. The old ones warned us, she thought in a brief moment of clarity. They warned us that suffering was coming, that we'd have to be stronger than the pain, stronger than the chains, stronger than the men who thought they owned us. But she was just a child, just a 10-year-old girl with salt eating into her flesh and darkness crushing her soul. How much strength could one child have? The night pressed down. The pain continued its relentless work, and somewhere far above, in the slave quarters, Josiah lay awake planning how he might save her, while Tia Ruth prayed to powers old and new, while the other slaves whispered Emma's name like a warning and a prayer. 52 days to go. 52 days in the tomb beneath the earth, where only God and the ancestors could see her suffering, where the salt burned eternal, where a child learned the deepest truths about slavery's cruelty, that it could destroy your body, could imprison your flesh, could torture you beyond endurance, but somewhere deep down, in the place where the ancestors lived, there was something it could never quite break, even if Emma didn't know that yet. Even if she only knew the darkness, and the pain, and the terrible certainty that this was just the beginning. Emma's consciousness drifted like smoke, neither fully awake nor properly asleep. The darkness wrapped around her like burial cloth, so thick she could almost taste it on her swollen tongue. Her back was pure fire, each wound a separate mouth of agony screaming into the void. The salt kept working its devilry, biting deeper into flesh that had no chance to heal, turning simple cuts into infected ravines of suffering. She tried to remember how she got here, tried to piece together the fragments. The cotton field. Harlan's face twisted with rage, the whip singing through air. The salt. Lord have mercy. The salt grinding into raw meat that used to be her skin. But the details blurred and shifted like fever dreams, and Emma couldn't hold on to them proper. Time meant nothing in this hole beneath the earth. Was it still the first day? Had days passed already? The darkness gave no answers, just pressed in tighter, making her feel buried alive. Emma's small body trembled, though whether from cold or fever or pure terror she couldn't tell. "Mama," she whispered again, knowing it was foolish, knowing her mama couldn't hear from whatever Louisiana hell she inhabited now. But the word brought comfort anyway, a talisman against the crushing loneliness. "Mama, I'm scared." Her voice sounded strange in the cellar, thin and hollow like it belonged to someone else. A ghost child, a forgotten soul. Maybe that's what she was now. Forgotten, erased from the world above where the sun still shone and people still moved and breathed free air. The pain sharpened suddenly, making Emma gasp. She tried to shift position, to find some angle that didn't press infected flesh against dirt or stone, but every movement brought fresh torment. Her thin shift had dried stuck to the wounds, and the fabric pulled at scabs whenever she breathed too deep. In the suffocating dark, Emma's mind reached back for happier memories, desperate for anything to hold on to. She remembered her mama singing while cooking in the quarters, that sweet voice rising up with songs from the old country, from Africa, from a time before chains, songs full of power and sorrow both. Kumbaya, my lord, kumbaya. Someone's crying, Lord, kumbaya. The melody drifted through Emma's fevered thoughts. Her mama had explained once that the words meant, "Come by here," in the old tongue, a plea for God or the ancestors to visit, to witness suffering, to not turn away from pain. Emma tried to sing it now, but her throat was too dry, her voice too broken. Instead, she just mouthed the words in the darkness, lips cracked and bleeding. "Come by here. See me. Don't let me disappear." A sound above made her freeze. Footsteps crossing the ground over her head. Heavy boots. White man's boots. Harlan? The master. She held her breath, terrified the door would open again, that more punishment waited. But the steps passed by without stopping, fading into distance. Emma released the breath she'd been holding and immediately regretted it. The movement sent lightning through her ruined back. She whimpered, hating herself for the sound but unable to stop it. This is how animals must feel in traps, she thought. Caught and hurting with no escape, just waiting for death or mercy, whichever came first. Her fingers explored the dirt floor around her, searching for something, anything. They found stones, old roots, scattered bits of rotten vegetable, and moisture. Blessed moisture seeping through cracks in the foundation. Emma pressed her cracked lips to the damp stone and licked, desperate for even drops of water. It tasted of earth and mold, but she didn't care. Her body needed it bad enough to ignore the foul flavor. The fever climbed higher as night came, though Emma had no way of knowing night from day in this perpetual midnight. Her thoughts scattered and reformed in strange patterns. She saw her daddy's face the day the traders took him, saw herself as a baby in her mama's arms, saw African queens her grandmother had told stories about, women of iron will and fierce hearts who never bowed to any master. "I won't bow neither," Emma whispered to the darkness, to the ancestors, to herself. "I won't break." But even as she said it, doubt crept in. How long could a child last like this? How many days before the infected wounds poisoned her blood beyond saving? How many nights in darkness before her mind shattered completely? She heard rats moving in the corner, their claws scratching on stone. Normally she'd be terrified, but now they seemed like company almost. At least she wasn't completely alone. The rats lived down here too, surviving in the dark and filth. If they could survive, maybe she could too. Emma's eyelids grew heavy, though closing them made no difference in the blackness. Sleep pulled at her, promising escape from pain, from fear, from the crushing awareness of her situation. She tried to resist, afraid she might not wake up again, but exhaustion won out. As consciousness slipped away, she heard it, faint but unmistakable. Voices outside the cellar door, men talking low and urgent. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. Guards. Harlan had posted guards like he promised, to make sure nobody helped her, nobody showed mercy. That land carried heavy spirits, Tia Ruth used to say about places where suffering soaked into the ground. Emma understood now. This cellar would carry her spirit if she died here, would hold her screams and tears and desperate prayers, would remember a child who suffered for the crime of looking at evil with honest eyes. The voices faded. The darkness deepened, and Emma fell into fever dreams where salt burned eternal and whips sang songs of sorrow, where ancestors walked through walls to whisper strength she didn't feel, where 54 more days stretched out like an eternity of pain with no end in sight. Her last conscious thought before sleep took her completely. Nobody's coming, nobody can help. I got to survive this alone. The rats scurried closer, and Emma didn't even flinch. The fever came like Sherman through Georgia, relentless, burning everything in its path, leaving nothing but scorched earth behind. Emma's small body shook with chills one moment, then burned hot as a forge fire the next. Her skin blazed to the touch, and sweat poured off her despite the cool dampness of the cellar. 5 days. Had it really been 5 days? Time moved strange in the darkness, stretching and contracting like living thing. Sometimes Emma felt she'd been in this hole forever, that the cotton fields and sunshine were just fever dreams. Other times she was convinced she'd only been locked away for hours, that surely someone would come soon to let her out. But nobody came, just the rats and the darkness and the pain that never stopped. The wounds on her back had turned into something monstrous. Emma could feel it even without seeing. The flesh swollen and hot, pus weeping from the deep cuts where the whip had laid her open. The salt had done exactly what Harlan intended, preventing any healing, keeping the wounds raw and vulnerable to infection. Now that infection raged through her like wildfire through dry grass. She tried to reach back and touch the worst of the injuries, but her arms wouldn't cooperate right. Everything felt disconnected, like her body belonged to someone else. Her fingers found one of the swollen ridges on her back and pressed gently. Pain exploded, white-hot and blinding, and fluid leaked out warm and thick. "Daddy," Emma moaned, lost in delirium. "Daddy, where'd they take you?" In her fever dreams, she was back at the auction block in Savannah, watching her father being sold. She was maybe 4 years old, small enough that the crowd of white faces loomed like giants. Her daddy stood on the block in chains, his head held high despite everything. The auctioneer was calling out prices, and white men were examining her daddy's teeth, his muscles, treating him like livestock. "We got us a prime buck here, gentlemen. Strong as an ox, good teeth, no signs of rebellion. Who'll start the bidding?" Emma had cried out then, reaching for her daddy, but her mama held her back tight. "Hush, child, hush now. Don't make no scene or they'll separate us too." Her daddy's eyes found theirs in the crowd. He didn't smile, couldn't, with the overseer's whip coiled ready nearby, but something passed between them. Love, sorrow, a promise that even chains couldn't break family bonds. Sold to Mr. Harrison of the Mississippi Delta for $800. They dragged her daddy away in chains, and Emma never saw him again. Years later, they heard through the slave grapevine that he died of fever picking cotton in some godforsaken Mississippi field. Worked to death like so many strong-backed men, used up and discarded like broken tools. "I'm gonna die too," Emma whispered in the darkness, her voice thick with fever. "Gonna die in this hole and nobody gonna remember." Her mama's face swam up out of memory then, beautiful and sad. Her mama before the hardness set in, before 2 children sold away and a husband torn from her arms turned her eyes to stone. Back when she still sang the old songs full-voiced and believed in something better. "Emma, baby, listen to me now," the fever vision of her mama said, kneeling beside her in the dark. "You got royal blood in your veins, child. Your great-grandmother was a queen in the old country, before the white devils stole us away. You got strength you don't even know about yet. I ain't strong, Mama. I'm just a child. I'm hurting so bad." "I know, baby. Lord knows I know. But pain is temporary. What you do with it, how you survive it, that's eternal. That's what the ancestors remember." Emma reached out for the vision, but her fingers found only cold dirt. Her mama wasn't really there. Nobody was there. She was alone with the rats and the darkness and the infection eating her alive from the inside out. She tried to scrape some of the dried salt from her wounds, her fingers clumsy and weak, but touching the injuries only made them worse, breaking open scabs and releasing fresh rivers of pus and blood. The smell was terrible, sweet and rotten, the smell of flesh going bad. Above her head she heard voices. Not the guards this time. These were familiar voices, slave voices speaking low and urgent. "How long now?" That was Josiah, his young voice tight with worry. 5 days. Tia Ruth's answer came heavy with grief. 5 days with no food, barely any water, and them wounds festering. Child can't survive much longer like this. "We gotta do something. We got to..." "Boy, you want to end up in there with her? Want your back split open and salted? Want Harlan to make an example of you too?" A long silence. Then Josiah again, breaking. "I can't just let her die, I can't. Sometimes all we can do is pray, child. Sometimes that's the only weapon slaves got." Emma wanted to call out, to let them know she could hear, that she was still alive. But her voice wouldn't work right, and besides, what would that accomplish? It would only bring them suffering if Harlan caught them near the cellar. Better to stay silent, better to bear this alone. The voices faded away, but knowing they'd been there, knowing someone cared, someone remembered, brought a tiny spark of warmth to Emma's frozen heart. She wasn't completely forgotten, not yet. The fever climbed higher, and Emma's mind drifted into stranger territories. She saw spirits walking through the cellar walls, tall African warriors with tribal scars, women with wise eyes and medicine bags, children who'd died on the slave ships crossing the terrible Middle Passage. They circled around her, chanting in languages older than slavery, older than America, older than the white man's conquest. "Hold on, little sister," they seemed to say. "Your suffering has purpose. Your pain feeds the river of resistance that will one day wash these chains away." But Emma didn't want purpose. She just wanted the hurting to stop, wanted her mama's arms around her, wanted to wake up and find this was all just a nightmare. She drifted in and out of consciousness as the day wore on. If it was day, night, morning, it all blurred together in the eternal darkness. Sometimes she woke gasping, certain she was drowning. Other times she came to screaming, fighting off dream demons that wore Harlan's face. And then, in a brief moment of clarity, Emma felt something that made her heart leap. Her toes. She could move her toes. The numbness that had crept up her legs during the worst of the fever was retreating. Blood was flowing again. Life was still fighting. "I ain't dead yet," she whispered, and it sounded like a prayer, like a promise, like a declaration of war against death itself. Outside the cellar, the afternoon sun beat down on the cotton fields where slaves picked and sang their work songs. Inside, in the darkness, a child fought for her life against infection and despair and the crushing weight of slavery's cruelty. 50 days to go, and Emma, delirious with fever but still breathing, still holding on, had just discovered something the ancestors had always known. The human spirit, properly motivated, can endure what seems impossible, even if she had to do it alone. The scraping of the bolt jolted Emma from her fever dreams. Light stabbed into the cellar like knives, and she squeezed her eyes shut against the pain of it. Footsteps on the ladder, heavy boots, the smell of tobacco and sweat and leather. Harlan. Well. His voice cut through the darkness like the whip he loved so much. "Let's see if our little lesson is taking hold." Emma tried to curl up smaller, tried to disappear into the dirt floor, but her body wouldn't cooperate. The fever had her in its grip, making everything slow and difficult. She could only lie there as Harlan's boots appeared in her limited field of vision, caked with red Georgia clay. He crouched down, his face swimming into focus. That cruel-hearted visage looked almost pleased, like a man surveying a job well done. His eyes traveled over Emma's trembling form, taking in the fever sweat, the infected wounds visible through her torn shift, the way she shook uncontrollably. "You look like hell, girl," Harlan observed, conversational-like. "That's good. That's real good. Means the lesson's sinking in deep." He reached out and grabbed Emma's chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. His fingers dug into her jaw hard enough to bruise. "You remember why you're here? You remember what happens to niggers who forget their place?" Emma's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her throat was too dry, her voice too broken. "Can't hear you," Harlan said mockingly. "What's that? You sorry now? You wish you'd kept your eyes down where they belong?" Somewhere deep inside, beneath the fever and the pain and the fear, Emma felt something stir, something that wouldn't bend, something her mama and daddy and all the ancestors had passed down through blood and suffering. She met Harlan's eyes again, not with defiance exactly, but with something worse. Recognition. She saw him for what he was, a small, cruel man whose only power came from the whip and the system that supported it. And she spit in his face. It wasn't much. Her mouth was too dry to produce proper saliva, just a weak spray of moisture that barely reached his cheek. But it was enough. Harlan's face went red as fresh blood. He released her chin and stood up so fast he almost hit his head on the low ceiling. His hand went to his whip instinctively, and Emma braced for the beating she knew was coming. But Harlan stopped himself, smiled instead, and that smile was more terrifying than any whip. "Oh no," he said softly. "No, that would be too quick, too merciful." He wiped the spit from his face with the back of his hand. "You just earned yourself something special, girl. You just guaranteed I'm gonna make these 55 days count." He walked to the corner of the cellar and picked up a tin cup that had been left there, probably by the last slave locked in this hole. He filled it from a puddle of stagnant water that had collected near the foundation, water green with algae and scum. "Thirsty, are you?" Harlan asked. "I bet you are. 5 days without proper water will do that." He walked back and stood over Emma, looking down at her like she was less than human, less than the rats that shared her prison. Then he dumped the water on the ground next to her face, just inches from her cracked lips. "There you go," he said. "Fresh water. All you gotta do is lap it up like the dog you are." Emma stared at the puddle forming in the dirt. Her body screamed for it, every cell crying out for moisture. Her tongue felt like old leather in her mouth. The fever burned through her, dehydrating her faster than the wounds bled. But she didn't move, didn't lower her face to the filthy water, wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Harlan waited, watching. When Emma didn't move, he laughed, a sound with no humor in it, just cruelty. "Stubborn little bitch, ain't you? That's all right. We got 50 more days to break that spirit. 50 more days for the salt to eat you alive, for the infection to spread, for the darkness to drive you mad." He started back toward the ladder. "You'll be begging to lap water from the ground before I'm done with you. You'll be begging for death itself." At the ladder, he paused and looked back. "Oh, and don't think your friends in the quarters gonna help you none. I got men watching this cellar day and night. Anyone tries to bring you food or water, anyone shows you even a bit of mercy, they're gonna get the same treatment you're getting. Double portions of salt, you want that on your conscience?" "No," Emma managed to whisper, the word tearing her throat. "What's that?" "Speak up, girl." "No, don't hurt them." Harlan smiled again. "Then you better suffer quiet-like. Better not make any noise, better not cause any trouble. You just lie here in the dark and think about your sins. Think about how a nigger child should never, ever look at a white man like he's less than God himself." He climbed the ladder, and just before he closed the door, shutting Emma back into total darkness, he delivered his final blow. 52 days left, girl. 52 days. You think you're suffering now? You ain't seen nothing yet. This punishment got an exact timeline, and I'm gonna make sure you feel every single day of it. The door slammed. The bolt scraped home. Darkness returned like a flood. Emma lay in the dirt, the puddle of scummy water inches from her face. Her body trembled with need, every instinct screaming at her to drink. But she wouldn't. Not like that. Not like a dog. Instead, she rolled slightly, ignoring the agony in her back, and pressed her cracked lips to the damp wall again, licking the moisture that seeped through the stones. It wasn't much, but it was something, and she'd taken it on her own terms, not Harlan's. 52 days, she whispered to the darkness, to the ancestors, to herself. "I can survive 52 more days. I have to." Above ground, the plantation bell rang, calling slaves to evening meal. In the quarters, folks would gather around the communal pot, sharing what little food they had, speaking in low voices about the child in the cellar. Josiah would stare at his cornbread and not eat. Tia Ruth would pray. Big Moses would clench his fists and imagine freedom. And down in the earth, Emma fought her private war against death and despair, armed with nothing but stubbornness and the unbreakable spirit her ancestors had forged in the fires of the Middle Passage. The water in the puddle slowly soaked into the dirt, disappearing. Emma watched it go without regret. Harlan had promised 52 more days of suffering, but he'd also given her something else, a timeline, an endpoint, proof that this torture, however terrible, was temporary. And temporary, the old ones always said, is something you can survive, even if it kills you trying. 12 days in the tomb beneath the earth. 12 days of darkness so complete that Emma had forgotten what light looked like. Her body was a map of suffering now, the wounds on her back festering like poisoned rivers, her ribs showing sharp through skin that clung to bone, her lips cracked and bleeding from thirst. But she was still alive. Barely, but alive. The fever came and went in waves, sometimes leaving her clear-headed enough to count the days by scratching marks in the dirt with her fingernail. Other times it carried her away to places where the dead walked and ancestors spoke in tongues of fire. She'd learned to tell the difference between waking and dreaming, though sometimes the line blurred so bad she couldn't be certain which side she stood on. Tonight, and she knew it was night by the quality of silence above, the way the world held its breath in darkness, Emma lay curled on her side, trying not to move because every movement tore at infected flesh. The rats had grown bold, crawling over her legs and arms, but she'd stopped caring. They were companions in suffering, creatures who understood what it meant to live in darkness and filth. She heard the guards change shift above, heavy boots walking away, different boots taking their place. The new guard coughed, spat, settled down. Emma closed her eyes and tried to find sleep, that blessed escape from pain. Then she heard it, a soft scratching at the cellar door. So quiet she almost thought she'd imagined it, but no. There it was again, deliberate, purposeful. Emma's heart jumped, fear and hope warring in her chest. Was it Harlan coming back with new torments? Or was it, "Child"? The whisper was so soft it was barely sound at all, but Emma recognized it immediately. Tia Ruth. "Tia." Emma tried to answer, but her voice came out as a croak. "Hush now, baby. Don't make no sound. I ain't got much time." Emma heard something sliding through the crack under the door. The gap was barely finger-wide, but it was enough. A piece of cloth, damp and cool, pushed through into the cellar. Then something wrapped in leaves. Cornbread. Maybe a mouthful's worth, but to Emma it was manna from heaven. "The guard's drunk," Tia Ruth whispered urgently. "Won't stay that way long. Listen to me, child. You gotta hold on. You hearing me? The quarter's been praying for you day and night. We ain't forgotten you." Emma crawled forward, every movement agony, and pressed her face to the gap in the door. She could see nothing but darkness, but she could smell Tia Ruth, the scent of wood smoke and lye soap and the herbs the old woman used for healing. "Hurts so bad," Emma whispered. "I know, baby. Lord knows I know, but you stronger than the hurt. You got queen's blood in your veins, child of Africa. Don't let these devils break you." Emma grabbed the damp cloth and pressed it to her cracked lips, sucking the moisture from it desperately. The water tasted of well water and hope. Then she unwrapped the cornbread and shoved it in her mouth, barely chewing, just kneading the substance, the proof that the world above still existed and someone in it still cared. "Josiah wanted to come," Tia Ruth continued, her voice tight with fear and love both. "Had to tie that boy down practically. He's planning something foolish, I can feel it. You got to survive, Emma. Got to live so he don't throw his life away trying to save you." "Tell him," Emma started, but Tia Ruth cut her off. "No time, guards stirring. But hear me now. I'm gonna try to come again when I can. Can't promise when, can't promise I won't get caught. But you ain't alone, child. You ain't forgotten." "Tia, wait." But footsteps were approaching above, the guard rousing from his drunken stupor. Emma heard Tia Ruth scramble away quick and quiet as a shadow. Heard the guard curse and call out, "Who's there? Show yourself." Emma held her breath, pressed against the cellar door, praying to every god she knew that Tia Ruth would escape. The guard's footsteps moved around the cellar, circling, heavy boots crushing grass. Then they paused, right above where Tia Ruth must be hiding. "I know somebody's out here," the guard growled. "Come out now or it's gonna be worse when I find you." Silence. Emma's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. "Please," she prayed, "please let her be safe. Don't let her suffer for showing me mercy." The guard waited, listening. Emma could hear him breathing, could almost feel his suspicion. Then, from the far side of the plantation, a dog barked. Once, twice. The guard's attention shifted. "Damn mutts," he muttered, and his footsteps moved away, heading toward the sound. Emma released the breath she'd been holding. Tia Ruth had escaped. This time. But they both knew it was only a matter of time before someone got caught. Before Harlan's cruelty reached beyond Emma to punish anyone who showed her kindness. She crawled back to her corner, clutching the damp cloth to her chest like treasure. The cornbread sat warm in her belly, the first food she'd had in 12 days. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Proof that love existed even in hell. That resistance took many forms, and sometimes the bravest act was simply showing mercy when the world demanded cruelty. Emma pressed the cloth to her worst wounds, and the cool moisture brought a moment of relief from the burning. She thought of Tia Ruth risking everything for this small kindness. Thought of Josiah planning something foolish out of love for a child he'd known since she was born. Thought of the quarters praying, keeping her name alive even as Harlan tried to erase her. "I ain't alone," she whispered to the darkness. "I ain't forgotten." Above, the guard settled back down, muttering about night sounds and runaway slaves. The plantation slept on, slaves and masters both, while in the earth below, a child discovered what the ancestors had always known. That oppression could steal your body, could imprison your flesh, could torture you beyond endurance, but it could never quite kill the human connections that made suffering bearable. Tia Ruth had given her more than bread and water. She'd given her hope, and hope, even more than food, could keep a body alive when death seemed certain. 43 days to go. Emma closed her eyes, the taste of cornbread still on her tongue, and for the first time in 12 days, she smiled. Just a little. Just enough to know she was still human, still capable of joy even in the depths of despair, still fighting, still alive. The fever returned with vengeance on the 18th day, burning through Emma like hellfire, turning her mind into a ship tossed on waves of delirium. She thrashed on the dirt floor, her infected back screaming protest, but she couldn't control her body no more. The ancestors had come to claim her or teach her, or maybe both at once. In the fever dream, Emma wasn't in the cellar anymore. She was in the belly of a slave ship, packed tight with bodies in the suffocating darkness. The stench was unbearable. Human waste, vomit, death, despair all mixed together in the airless hold. She could hear chains rattling, people weeping, prayers in languages she'd never learned but somehow understood. "Grandmother," Emma called out in the dream. "Where are you?" "Here, child." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, ancient and young at once. "I am here, as I have always been." A woman materialized from the darkness of the ship's hold. She was tall and regal despite the chains, her skin marked with tribal scars that caught the dim light filtering through the deck above. Her eyes held wisdom older than slavery, older than America, older than the white man's conquest. "You're my grandmother's grandmother," Emma whispered, knowing it was true the way you know things in dreams. "I am Iodel," the woman said. "I was stolen from my village when the moon was full and the raiders came with guns and chains. They took me from my children, from my husband, from everything I knew. They put me in this floating coffin with hundreds of others, and we crossed the great water in suffering you cannot imagine." The ship rolled on phantom waves, and Emma felt the nausea, the terror, the crushing certainty that death would be a mercy. Around them, people moaned in agony. Some had already died, their bodies left to rot among the living because the white men who ran the ship cared nothing for African lives. Many jumped overboard when they got the chance, Iodella continued, her voice steady despite the horror surrounding them. Chose the ocean over slavery, chose death over dishonor. But I survived, child. I survived because I knew my spirit was stronger than their chains. "How?" Emma asked, her child's voice small in the darkness. "How did you survive when everything was so terrible?" Iodel reached out and touched Emma's face with hands that bore the marks of shackles. "The same way you will survive, little one. By remembering who you are. By holding on to the truth that we are more than what they make us. We are children of kings and queens, of warriors and healers, of people who built great cities when the Europeans still lived in caves." The ship's hold transformed around them, becoming a village in Africa. Emma saw it through Iodel's memories. Mud houses with thatched roofs, children playing, women pounding grain, men working metal. a community living in harmony before the slavers came. She saw the night of the raid, torches burning, people screaming, families torn apart. Saw Ayodele fighting like a lioness to protect her children, being clubbed down and dragged away in chains. "They took our freedom," Ayodele said, "but they could not take our souls, could not erase the knowledge of who we were. That is what you must hold on to, Emma. In that dark cellar, when the pain seems unbearable, remember, you are my blood. You carry Africa in your veins." Emma felt her own wounds burning, the salt still doing its cruel work even in dreams. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she admitted. "Strength is not the absence of fear or pain," Ayodele said. "Strength is surviving despite them. Every day you live is an act of resistance. Every breath you take is a victory against those who want you dead." The dream shifted again, and Emma was back in the ship's hold. But now she could see the whole terrible journey. Saw people dying by the dozens from disease and despair. Saw the white sailors throwing bodies overboard like garbage. Saw a woman give birth in chains. Saw the baby die before it could draw 10 breaths. Saw the depths of cruelty humans could inflict on one another when they stopped seeing each other as human. But she also saw resistance. Saw people sharing water when there was barely enough for one. Saw mothers soothing children who weren't their own. Saw men and women keeping their spirits alive through song, through prayer, through sheer stubborn refusal to let the white devils win. "Some of us made it to the other side of that ocean," Ayodele said. "We're sold on auction blocks, separated again, sent to plantations where the suffering continued. But we survived, child. We survived, and we passed down our stories, our spirits, our strength. It flows through your blood now, all these years later. You are the answer to our prayers, the proof that they could not break us completely." Emma felt tears on her face, wasn't sure if they belonged to her dreaming self or her fevered body in the cellar. "I wish you were here with me," she whispered. "I am always with you," Ayodele said, and placed her hand over Emma's heart. "We all are. Every ancestor who suffered and survived lives in here. Draw on us when your own strength fails. Remember that your pain is not meaningless. It is part of a long chain of resistance that will one day break these shackles forever." The dream began to fade, the ship's hold dissolving back into the darkness of the cellar. Emma tried to hold on to Ayodele, but the ancestor was already becoming smoke and memory. "Wait!" Emma called out. "Don't leave me!" "I never leave you, child. Listen for us in the silence. Feel us in your heartbeat. We are the voices that cannot be silenced, the memories that cannot be erased. Survive, Emma. Survive and carry our stories forward." Emma woke gasping, her body drenched in fever sweat. The cellar was as dark and terrible as ever, the pain in her back as sharp, the thirst as desperate. But something had changed. She felt less alone now, more connected to something larger than herself. She tried to move her legs and discovered with shock that she could. The fever-induced paralysis that had gripped her lower body was lifting. Blood flowed again, carrying life instead of stagnation. It was a small victory, but in this place, small victories were everything. "Thank you, grandmother," Emma whispered to the darkness, to the ancestors, to the spirits who walked through walls to give her strength. She wiggled her toes deliberately, one by one, reveling in the simple fact that she could. The wounds still burned, the infection still raged, but her body was fighting back. She was fighting back. 37 days to go. Emma closed her eyes and listened to her heartbeat, the rhythm steady and strong despite everything. In that pulse, she heard the drums of Africa, the songs of the Middle Passage, the prayers of the Quarters, the collective heartbeat of a people who refused to die no matter how hard the world tried to kill them. She would survive this, not because it was easy, but because her ancestors demanded it, because every breath was an act of resistance, because she was Ayodele's blood, and royalty does not bow. The whip's crack echoed across the plantation yard, and Emma heard it even in her underground prison. Once, twice, 3 times. Each strike followed by a scream that tore Emma's heart worse than any salt could tear flesh. Tia Ruth. Emma knew it was her before the voices confirmed it, knew it the way you know terrible things in your bones before your mind catches up. She pressed herself against the cellar door, trying to hear what was happening above, tears already streaming down her wasted face. "You thought you could sneak around my watch?" Harlan's voice rang out, loud and theatrical. He was making a show of this, wanted everyone to see. "Thought you could help that little rebel in the cellar without consequences?" Another crack of the whip. Another scream from Tia Ruth, weaker this time. The old woman's voice so strong in prayer and song, reduced to animal sounds of pain. "No!" Emma wanted to shout, wanted to burst through the cellar door and stop this, but she could barely stand. Her voice came out as a broken whisper. "Please, no, not her, not because of me." Through the gaps in the door, she heard gathered slaves forced to watch, heard their silence heavy as stones. This was the lesson Harlan wanted taught: help the rebel child and suffer her fate. Show mercy and receive none in return. "Who told you?" Tia Ruth's voice came between gasps of pain. "Who betrayed me?" Emma's blood turned cold. Betrayed. Someone had told. Someone had seen Tia Ruth at the cellar door 12 nights ago and reported it to Harlan. But who? Who among the quarters would condemn one of their own? "Does it matter?" Harlan laughed. "What matters is you broke the rules, and we all know what happens to niggers who break rules." The whip fell again and again. Emma counted 15 strokes, then 20, then lost count as the screams blended together into one long keen of agony. She clutched the damp cloth Tia Ruth had given her, the one small mercy that was now being punished, and sobbed into the darkness. "That's enough for now," Harlan finally said, breathing hard from the exertion. "Put her in the stocks. 3 days with no food or water. Let everyone see what happens to those who show forbidden kindness." Footsteps, dragging sounds, Tia Ruth being hauled away. Emma heard the old woman's breath, ragged and wet like something was broken inside. Heard her whimper as they shoved her into the wooden stocks at the center of the yard, where everyone would have to see her suffering as they worked. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Harlan shouted to the assembled slaves. "That child in the cellar is being punished for a reason. Anyone tries to help her, this is what you get. And next time it'll be worse. Next time I'll use the salt." The crowd dispersed in silence, forced back to their work. But Emma heard whispers, urgent and angry, as people passed near the cellar. "Who told? Who's the Judas among us? Somebody sold Tia Ruth for favor with the master." Then a voice Emma recognized made her heart stop. It was Samuel, a young field hand who'd always seemed weak-willed, scared to death of everything. His voice trembled as he spoke to someone near the cellar. "I had to," Samuel was saying, defensive and miserable at once. "Harlan said if I didn't tell him who was sneaking around at night, he'd sell my mama south. What was I supposed to do? Let them take my mama to the cane fields to die?" "You let them whip Tia Ruth near to death, that's what you did," came Josiah's voice, hard as iron. "You're a coward and a traitor. Your mama would rather die than know her son turned Judas. You think she's gonna forgive you for this?" Emma heard scuffling like Josiah was lunging for Samuel, and other voices intervening to separate them. Big Moses's deep rumble. "Enough! Fighting each other is what they want. Don't give them the satisfaction. But I know what he done. We all know. And he gonna have to live with that. Gonna have to see Tia Ruth in them stocks every day and know he put her there. That's punishment enough." The voices moved away, but Emma heard Samuel crying, heard him saying over and over, I'm sorry, I didn't have no choice." But he did have a choice, Emma thought bitterly. Everyone always has a choice. He chose his fear over Tia Ruth's life, chose to protect himself by destroying someone else. That's what slavery did to people, turned them against each other, made them willing to sacrifice neighbors to save family, made survival a zero-sum game where someone had to lose for you to win. Emma understood it, even as she hated it. Understood how desperation could make people do terrible things, how the overseer's threat to sell Samuel's mother south was every bit as cruel as the whip, maybe worse. How slavery created impossible choices where every option led to someone suffering, but understanding didn't make forgiveness easier. didn't make the sound of Tia Ruth's screams hurt any less. 3 days in the stocks with no food or water. Tia Ruth was old, her body already worn down by decades of hard labor. 3 days in the Georgia sun without water could kill a young, healthy person. For Tia Ruth, it was damn near a death sentence. All because she'd shown a child mercy. All because she'd pushed a bit of cornbread under a cellar door. Emma curled up in her corner and wept, the tears burning tracks down her dirty face. This was her fault. If she'd never looked at Harlan wrong, never sparked his rage, none of this would be happening. Tia Ruth would be safe. Samuel wouldn't have become Judas. The quarters wouldn't be torn apart by suspicion and fear. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered into the darkness. "Tia Ruth, I'm so sorry." Above her, the sun beat down merciless on the woman in the stocks. Tia Ruth's head hung low, blood from the whipping staining her torn dress. Slaves walked past on their way to the fields, forced to see her suffering, forced to learn the lesson Harlan was teaching. But they also saw something else. A woman who'd risked everything for a child's sake. A woman who chose mercy over safety. And in that, paradoxically, they found inspiration. Because if Tia Ruth could be that brave, that selfless, maybe they could too. Maybe resistance wasn't always dramatic escape attempts or violent rebellion. Maybe sometimes it was just showing kindness when the world demanded cruelty. In the cellar, Emma made a promise to the darkness, to Tia Ruth, to herself. She would survive these 55 days, would survive and remember every detail, would live to tell the story of an old woman's courage and a traitor's choice, and the impossible decisions slavery forced on people. Would live so the suffering meant something. 37 days to go, and now every one of them carried the weight of Tia Ruth's sacrifice. Emma closed her eyes and prayed for the old woman's survival, knowing prayers were all she had to give, and hoping they would be enough. 28 days. Halfway through her sentence, Emma scratched another mark in the dirt wall with her fingernail, counting them obsessively like a prisoner marking time. 28 lines in the darkness, 28 eternities of suffering, 27 more to go. The numbers had become her anchor to sanity. Without them, time dissolved into meaningless darkness, days and nights bleeding together into one long nightmare. But as long as she could count, as long as she could mark the passage of time, she knew she was still human, still thinking, still fighting. Her body had changed in ways that terrified and fascinated her. The wounds on her back had formed thick scabs, though infection still seeped from the deepest cuts where the salt had done its worst damage. She was thin as a skeleton, her ribs standing out sharp under skin that seemed stretched too tight. Her hair had started falling out in clumps from malnutrition and stress. But she could move now, could crawl around the small space of her prison, could stretch her aching limbs. The fever came and went, but it no longer controlled her completely. Her body had adapted to the infection somehow, fighting it to a stalemate. She wasn't healing, but she wasn't dying either, just existing in a terrible limbo between life and death. Emma had learned the rhythms of the plantation above, knew when the work bell rang at dawn, when it rang for midday rest, when it rang for evening. Knew the sound of different guards' footsteps, could tell who was watching the cellar by how they walked. Knew when it was safe to make small noises, and when she needed to be silent as the grave. She'd also learned to talk to herself, to keep her mind occupied in the endless darkness. Not out loud, that would attract attention, but in whispers so soft, they were barely breath. "My name is Emma," she would whisper. "I am 10 years old. My mama's name was Sarah, my daddy's name was Jacob. I am a child of Africa. I am blood of Ayodele. I will survive this." The words became a ritual, a prayer, a promise. She repeated them every time the darkness threatened to swallow her whole. Every time she felt her mind starting to slip away into madness. "I will survive this. I will survive this. I will survive this." Sometimes she talked to the ancestors, carrying on conversations with Ayodele and the other spirits who visited in her dreams. Asked them questions about Africa, about freedom, about what happened to the soul when the body broke beyond repair. Sometimes she talked to Tia Ruth, though she didn't know if the old woman was still alive. The stalks had been 3 days ago, or was it 4? And Emma hadn't heard anything since. No screams, no voices mentioning her name, nothing. The silence was worse than knowing. "Please be alive, Tia Ruth," Emma whispered to the darkness. "Please forgive me for bringing suffering to you. I never meant—" Her voice broke. Even whispering hurt her throat, raw from disuse and thirst. Water was still scarce, just what moisture seeped through the cellar walls and what little condensation formed in the cool earth. She licked the stones constantly, desperate for every drop. Hunger had become a living thing inside her, gnawing at her insides with teeth sharp as any overseer's whip. The single piece of cornbread Tia Ruth had given her was a distant memory now, her stomach cramping painfully around nothing. But she'd learned that after a certain point, the hunger dulled, became background noise she could almost ignore. Emma heard footsteps approaching the cellar and froze, heavy boots, multiple pairs. Her heart started hammering. This wasn't the guards' regular patrol. This was something different. The bolts scraped back. The door opened. Light flooded in, blinding her. Emma squeezed her eyes shut and scrambled back into her corner, making herself as small as possible. "Jesus Christ," a voice said. Not Harlan, someone else. "She's still alive?" "Unfortunately," came Harlan's voice, cold and disappointed. "Thought for sure the infection would have killed her by now. Girl's got more fight in her than I expected." Emma forced her eyes open just enough to see through her lashes. 2 men stood at the top of the cellar stairs. Harlan and another white man she didn't recognize. The stranger was better dressed, maybe the master himself or a visiting plantation owner. 28 days in these conditions, the stranger said, shaking his head. That's impressive, actually. Most wouldn't last a week." "That's the problem with these niggers," Harlan said. "Too stubborn to know when to die." The stranger descended the ladder and Emma got a better look at him. Older than Harlan, with gray hair and clothes that spoke of wealth. He approached Emma slowly, like she was a dangerous animal, and crouched down to examine her. "Look at me, girl," he commanded. Emma raised her eyes, too tired to show the defiance that had gotten her here in the first place. The man studied her face, her wasted body, the visible infection on her back. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The human spirit is a fascinating thing, isn't it? Even reduced to this, she still has fire in those eyes." He stood and turned to Harlan. "I came to see if the rumors were true. They say you're torturing a child to make a point about discipline." Harlan's face hardened. "I'm teaching a valuable lesson about respect and obedience. Can't let them think they can look at white folks however they please. And the salt in the wounds, the 55-day sentence? Traditional methods, sir. Been used on plantations for generations. Keeps the others in line." The stranger nodded slowly, and Emma felt a flicker of hope die. She'd thought maybe this man would stop it, would show mercy. But he was just another master, just another white man who saw her suffering as a lesson rather than a crime. "Well," the stranger said, "carry on then, though I'd suggest checking on her more regularly. Dead slaves don't make good examples. You want her alive at the end of those 55 days, scarred enough to remember but functional enough to work." "Yes, sir," Harlan said, barely concealing his irritation at being told how to do his job. They climbed out of the cellar, and the door slammed shut again. Darkness returned like a coffin lid closing. Emma lay in the dirt, trembling. 27 days to go. 27 more days of this hell, and she'd just learned that her survival wasn't mercy. It was calculated. They wanted her alive at the end so she could serve as a walking reminder of what happened to slaves who forgot their place. She was to be a living scar on the plantation's body, a permanent warning to others. "I will survive this," Emma whispered, but the words tasted like ash now. "I will survive this. I will survive this." The darkness pressed in, and somewhere above, the plantation bell rang for evening meal. Emma closed her eyes and began counting again. Each number a step toward freedom or death. She wasn't sure which anymore. But she would count. Would mark her days, would hold on to her name and her humanity with bleeding fingers, because that's what survivors do. The door opened 3 days after the stranger's visit. And this time it wasn't Harlan who descended into Emma's tomb. It was an older white man carrying a black leather bag, moving careful-like down the ladder with one hand gripping the rungs tight. "Lord Almighty," the man muttered when he reached the bottom, and his eyes adjusted to the dimness. "What kind of barbarism is this?" Emma didn't move from her corner. Couldn't tell if this was another torment or something different. The man wore spectacles and had the soft hands of someone who didn't work the fields. A doctor, maybe. The plantation physician who treated slaves when they were too valuable to let die. "Child," the man said, his voice gentler than any white voice she'd heard in 28 days. "I'm Dr. Morrison. Master Wexford sent me to examine you. I won't hurt you, I promise." Promises from white folks, Emma had learned, were worth less than the breath it took to speak them. But she was too weak to resist when the doctor approached and carefully turned her to examine her back. His sharp intake of breath told her everything she needed to know about how bad the wounds looked. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Dr. Morrison whispered. "These are infected badly, very badly. And is that—" He touched one of the wounds gently, and his fingers came away white with salt crystals. They put salt in fresh whip wounds. What kind of devil does that to a child? Emma found her voice cracked and weak. "Overseer Harlan, sir. He said I looked at him wrong." Dr. Morrison was silent for a long moment. Then he opened his bag and pulled out cloths and bottles. "I'm going to clean these wounds," he said. "It's going to hurt, but if I don't, the infection will kill you within the week. Do you understand?" Emma nodded. What was more pain on top of everything she'd already endured? The doctor wet a cloth with something that smelled sharp and medicinal, then began washing the wounds on her back. Emma bit down on her lips so hard she tasted blood, trying not to scream as the solution hit infected flesh. It burned worse than the salt, like liquid fire eating into her. "I know, child, I know, Doctor," Morrison murmured. "But this has to be done. These wounds should have been treated weeks ago. What were they thinking?" "Thinking to make an example," Emma gasped between waves of pain. 55 days in the dark, 28 done, 27 to go. The doctor's hands paused. 55 days? They mean to keep you here 55 days with infected wounds and no medical care? "Yes, sir. That's not discipline, that's attempted murder." But even as he said it, they both knew nothing would change. Dr. Morrison might be appalled, might think it barbaric, but he wouldn't challenge Harlan or the master. Wouldn't risk his position to save a slave child. That's how the system worked. Even the good white folks were complicit in the cruelty. He continued cleaning the wounds, working methodically despite Emma's whimpers. When he was done, he applied some kind of salve that felt cool and soothing against the raw flesh. Then he bandaged her back with clean cloth, working carefully. "There," he said finally. "That should help with the infection. But child," he looked at her seriously, his eyes sad behind the spectacles, "these wounds are bad. Some of them are down to the bone. Even with treatment, you might not survive another 27 days in these conditions." "I'll survive," Emma said with more conviction than she felt. "I got to." Dr. Morrison pulled out a canteen of water and held it to her cracked lips. Emma drank desperately. The clean water, the most beautiful thing she'd tasted in her life. He let her drink her fill, then produced a piece of bread from his bag. "Eat slowly," he warned. "Your stomach's not used to food anymore." Emma took small bites, forcing herself not to gulp it down even though every instinct screamed to devour it. The bread sat heavy in her shrunken stomach, but it was sustenance, life, hope. When she'd finished, Dr. Morrison sat back on his heels and looked at her with something like pity. "I wish I could do more," he said. "Wish I could tell them to let you out, to stop this madness. But you won't," Emma finished for him. "Because I'm just a slave, and slaves don't matter as much as keeping the master happy." The doctor flinched like she'd struck him. "It's not that simple. Ain't it though?" Emma met his eyes, and in that moment she saw him clearly. A man who knew right from wrong but chose comfort over courage. Who would wash her wounds and speak kind words but wouldn't actually challenge the system that created those wounds in the first place. Dr. Morrison stood up, gathering his supplies. At the ladder he paused. I'll speak to Master Wexford. Tell him you need better conditions if you're meant to survive your sentence. Will he listen? Probably not, but I'll try. Empty promises, Emma thought. The road to hell paved with them. After the doctor left, climbing back up into the light and closing the door behind him, Emma lay in her corner and stared at the darkness. Her back felt better with the clean bandages, her stomach fuller with bread, her throat less raw from the water. But she knew it wouldn't last. Knew Harlan would be furious when he found out the doctor had helped her. Knew these small mercies would be paid for in future cruelty. Sure enough, hours later, heavy boots on the ladder announced Harlan's return. He carried a lantern that made Emma's eyes water after so long in darkness. "So," Harlan said, his voice deadly calm, "the good doctor took pity on you, did he? Cleaned your wounds, gave you food and water?" Emma didn't answer. Knew anything she said would be wrong. "Dr. Morrison has a soft heart for niggers," Harlan continued. "Thinks you're all human beings deserving of mercy, but he don't understand discipline like I do. Don't understand that sometimes you got to be cruel to be kind." He knelt down and ripped the bandages off Emma's back in one brutal motion. She screamed, couldn't help it, as the cloth tore away some of the healing scabs. "There," Harlan said with satisfaction. "Can't have you getting too comfortable now, can we? Doctor might have cleaned those wounds, but I guarantee they'll be infected again in a day or two. And that salve he used?" Harlan pulled out a familiar burlap sack. "Let's replace it with something more appropriate." Emma knew what was coming, but couldn't move fast enough to stop it. Harlan grabbed a handful of salt and pressed it directly into the freshly exposed wounds. The scream that tore from Emma's throat was inhuman. The pain so intense that her vision went white, then black, then nothing as consciousness fled. When she woke up, alone in the darkness again, she tasted blood in her mouth from biting her tongue. Her back blazed with renewed agony, all of Dr. Morrison's work undone in seconds. "Then let her die slowly," she remembered Harlan saying to the doctor, back in the fever dreams. 27 days to go, and now Emma understood. They would keep her alive just barely, would sabotage any healing, would ensure she suffered every single moment of her sentence. But she would survive anyway, out of spite if nothing else. Out of sheer stubborn refusal to give Harlan the satisfaction of breaking her completely. The salt burned eternal, but so did Emma's will to live. And in that contest, she was determined to see which one lasted longer. 37 days in the darkness, and Emma had almost forgotten what her own voice sounded like. She'd been silent for so long, afraid that any sound would bring Harlan's wrath, that when the song came bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her soul, it startled her as much as it would startle anyone listening. It started as a hum, barely audible even to herself, a melody her mama used to sing while working in the fields, one of them old spirituals that carried coded messages about freedom and the Underground Railroad. The notes felt strange in her throat, rusty from disuse, but they also felt right, felt necessary. Emma's voice grew stronger, words forming from memory. "Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here." The song filled the cellar, soft but insistent, like water finding its way through cracks in stone. Emma sang because she needed to hear something besides rats and her own ragged breathing. Sang because the silence had been crushing her spirit worse than any physical torture. Sang because it was the one thing Harlan couldn't take from her. Her voice was weak, cracked, barely more than a whisper, but it carried. Sound traveled strange underground, finding pathways through earth and stone that light couldn't follow. In the quarters, old Big Moses was walking past the cellar on his way to the well when he heard it. He stopped dead in his tracks, listening. That child was still alive, still had enough strength to sing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Pride and sorrow mixed together so fierce he had to wipe his eyes. "She's singing," he whispered to himself. "Lord have mercy, that child is singing." He stood there a moment longer, then moved on before the guards noticed him lingering. But the song stayed with him, echoing in his mind. By evening, word had spread through the quarters like wildfire. Emma was singing. The child they'd all thought half dead was singing spirituals in her underground tomb. Some folks said it was her spirit leaving her body, preparing for death. Others said it was a sign of strength, of resistance, of unbroken will. That night, after the work bell rang and the slaves gathered in the quarters for their meager evening meal, Tia Ruth, who had survived the stocks but barely, her body broken and aged 10 years in 3 days, began to hum the same melody Emma had sung. Others joined in, soft at first, then stronger. My Lord, he calls me by the thunder. The trumpet sounds within my soul. I ain't got long to stay here. The song spread from cabin to cabin, voice joining voice until the whole quarters was singing. Not loud enough to draw attention from the big house, but loud enough that Emma, in her cellar below, could hear them answering her call. She stopped singing and listened, tears streaming down her face. They remembered her. They were telling her through song that she wasn't alone, that they carried her in their hearts, that they were praying for her survival. Josiah stood outside his cabin, his young voice strong and clear as he sang, Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. He was singing to Emma, had been in love with her since they were children playing in the dirt behind the quarters. Was singing promises that when she got out, if she got out, he would help her escape north, would follow the drinking gourd with her, would die trying to get her to freedom. But Harlan heard it too. The overseer came storming out of his cabin near the big house, whip in hand, rage turning his face purple in the twilight. He burst into the quarters where slaves were still singing, and the music died like a candle snuffed out. What in hell do you think you're doing? Harlan roared. Singing? You think this is some kind of church service? The slaves fell silent, heads bowed, but their defiance hung in the air like smoke. Who started it? Harlan demanded, his whip uncoiling like a serpent. Who was the first to sing? Nobody answered. Couldn't point to just one person when the whole quarters had joined in. Couldn't betray each other again after Samuel's treachery with Tia Ruth. Harlan's eyes scanned the crowd and landed on Tia Ruth, still weak from her time in the stocks. You, he said. I should have known. Can't keep your mouth shut for nothing, can you, old woman? We was just singing spirituals, massa, Tia Ruth said, her voice steady despite her fear. Ain't no harm in singing to the Lord. The harm is in encouraging that little rebel in the cellar. You think I don't know what you're doing? Think I don't understand you're trying to give her hope, trying to tell her she ain't forgotten? Harlan stepped closer to Tia Ruth. Well, let me make something clear to all of you. That child in the cellar is being punished. She don't deserve your songs or your prayers or your pity. She deserves to suffer for her disrespect. He turned to address the whole group. From now on, any slave caught singing within hearing distance of that cellar will get 10 lashes. And if I hear that girl singing again, I'll add 10 more days to her sentence. You want her to suffer longer? Then keep singing. See if I care. The threat hung heavy in the night air. 10 more days. That would be 65 days total. Emma might not survive the original 55, much less 65. Harlan stalked away, leaving the quarters in frightened silence. But after he was gone, after the guards settled back into their posts and the plantation fell quiet for the night, Tia Ruth began to hum again. So soft it was barely sound at all, but enough that those close by could hear. And one by one, others joined her. Not singing the words now, just humming the melody. A sound that could be mistaken for wind if anyone asked, but that carried all the same meaning, all the same solidarity. In the cellar, Emma heard it. The humming drifted down through cracks in the earth like rain through a roof. And she knew what they were doing. Knew they were risking punishment to tell her they stood with her, that her suffering wasn't invisible, that her song had been heard and answered. She pressed her hand against the cold dirt wall, imagining she could feel their presence on the other side. Imagine Josiah's hand pressed against the ground above, Tia Ruth's prayers soaking into the earth, Big Moses' strength flowing down through stone and clay. Thank you, Emma whispered. Thank you for remembering me. 18 days to go. 18 more days and she would emerge from this tomb, scarred but unbroken. Would walk out into the sunlight and look Harlan in the eye again, and this time he would see what he'd failed to destroy. a spirit that not even salt and darkness could extinguish. Emma began to hum along with the quarters above, her voice joining theirs in silent rebellion. It was the smallest act of resistance, barely even an act at all, but it meant everything, because that's what the spirituals had always been about. Finding ways to resist that the masters couldn't quite punish, carrying messages they couldn't quite decode, holding on to humanity in a system designed to strip it away. The humming continued into the night, soft as a lullaby, strong as a prayer, promising that no matter how long the darkness lasted, the light was still somewhere waiting. And Emma, child of Africa, daughter of Iodel, would survive to see it. The ancestors demanded nothing less. The storm came like God's own fury, rolling across the Georgia plantation with thunder that shook the earth and lightning that split the sky like the world was ending. Emma heard it building all afternoon, the wind picking up, the air pressure changing even in her underground tomb, the distant rumble growing closer and closer. When the rain started, it wasn't no gentle Georgia shower. It was a deluge, a biblical flood, water coming down so hard it sounded like drums on the ground above. And the cellar, that hole dug into the red clay earth, began to fill. At first, it was just moisture seeping through the walls faster than usual, pooling in the low spots of the dirt floor. Emma moved to higher ground such as it was, pressing herself against the far wall. But the water kept coming, flowing in through cracks in the foundation, dripping from the ceiling, rising inch by inch. "No," Emma whispered, her heart starting to race. "No, no, no." She'd survived 37 days of darkness and salt and starvation, survived infection and fever and Harlan's cruelty. But drowning in her own prison was a death she hadn't anticipated. The water was cold, shockingly cold, and it climbed steadily up her legs. Ankle deep, then calf deep. The cellar was flooding, and there was nowhere to go, no way to escape. The door above was bolted shut, and even if Emma screamed, even if the guards heard her, they might not care enough to save a punished slave child. Emma pounded on the door with her fists, her voice finally finding strength in terror. "Help, help me, please, I'm drowning down here." Thunder crashed overhead, drowning out her cries. The storm raged on, uncaring. The water rose to her knees, then her thighs. Emma scrambled onto the wooden shelves that held the rotting vegetables, but they were old and weak, creaking under her weight. "Please," she screamed again. "Somebody help me." The water kept rising, waist deep now. Emma could feel things floating around her in the dark. The rats that had been her companions, now dead and bloated. Pieces of rotten wood. The cloth Tia Ruth had given her, torn from her desperate grasp by the current. She thought of all the ancestors who drowned in the middle passage, thrown overboard or suffocated in flooded holds. Thought of her grandmother Iodel's stories about the ocean claiming so many African souls that the fish wouldn't eat their flesh, respecting the tragedy. Was she about to join them? To die by water after surviving so much else? "I ain't ready," Emma sobbed, clinging to the shelf as water lapped at her chest. "I ain't ready to go." The lightning flashed outside, and for one brief moment light came through the cracks in the door, illuminating the flooded cellar. Emma saw her situation clearly, saw how high the water had risen, saw that she had maybe minutes before it reached the ceiling, saw her own death approaching in cold, murky waves. But she also saw something else. The water, filthy as it was washing over her infected wounds. The salt that had been embedded in her flesh for 45 days was dissolving, being carried away by the flood. The scabs were softening, the pus draining out. It hurt something terrible, like being flayed alive, but it was also cleaning her. Emma gritted her teeth against the pain and deliberately submerged her back in the rising water, forcing herself to let it wash over the wounds despite the agony. She was going to drown, at least she'd die clean. At least the salt wouldn't claim her. The water reached her neck. Emma tilted her head back, gasping for air as the water level climbed higher and higher. She could touch the ceiling now with her fingers, could feel the rough wood pressing down. The shelf creaked ominously beneath her, threatening to collapse. This is it, she thought. This is how it ends. But then, a miracle or just good fortune. The rain started to slow. The deluge became a downpour. The downpour became heavy rain. The heavy rain became a steady fall. And most importantly, the water stopped rising. Emma clung to the shelf, her chin barely above water, waiting, praying, counting her heartbeats to stay focused, to keep from panicking completely. Slowly, so slowly, the water began to recede, draining out through the same cracks it had come in, flowing back into the Georgia clay. Neck deep became shoulder deep, became chest deep. Emma's feet found the floor again, and she stood there shaking, alive, somehow still alive. The storm passed overhead, thunder moving into the distance. The rain stopped, and Emma found herself standing in ankle-deep mud and filth, her whole body trembling with cold and shock and relief. But her back, sweet Jesus, her back felt different. Still hurt, still burned, but different. She reached around carefully and felt the wounds. The flesh was soft and waterlogged, but the hard crust of salt and infection was gone, washed away by the flood. For the first time in 45 days, her wounds were clean. Emma heard movement above, the bolt scraping back, light from a lantern stabbing down. A guard's voice, curious and a little worried. "She's still alive down there?" Another voice, Harlan's, irritated. "Check on her. Can't have her drowning before her sentence is up. That'd ruin the whole lesson." The guard descended with the lantern, and Emma saw his face change when he saw her. Standing in the flooded cellar, drenched and shaking but unmistakably alive, her eyes burning with something that might have been rage or might have been triumph. "She's alive," the guard called up. "Wet as hell, but breathing." "Leave her," Harlan ordered. "Water'll drain out by morning, and maybe next time she'll appreciate having a dry hole to suffer in." The guard climbed out, taking the light with him. The door slammed shut. Darkness returned, but Emma stood there in the mud and smiled. Actually smiled, because the storm had given her what Dr. Morrison couldn't, what Tia Ruth's kindness couldn't, what even her own body's healing couldn't manage. It had washed away the salt. 10 days to go. 10 more days and she'd walk out of here scarred but alive, wounded but unbroken. The flood had tried to kill her and ended up saving her instead. Somewhere in the darkness, Emma heard a sound that made her freeze. A pair of eyes reflecting in the dim light filtering through the door cracks. Someone was outside the cellar, watching through the gaps. Someone had witnessed her survival of the flood. And as the eyes disappeared, Emma could have sworn she heard a whisper. 10 days, Emma. Hold on 10 more days. Josiah. Her heart swelled with hope so fierce it almost hurt worse than the wounds. She wasn't alone. She'd never been alone. And in 10 days, come hell or high water, and she'd just survived both, she would be free of this tomb. The ancestors had sent the storm for a reason, and Emma was finally beginning to understand what Iadel had meant about suffering having purpose. 5 days after the storm, with only 5 days left in her sentence, Emma woke to the sound of whispered voices outside the cellar door. Not the guards. These voices were careful, desperate, familiar. Her heart leaped even before she heard Josiah's voice, low and urgent. "Emma, you awake down there?" She crawled to the door, pressed her face against the narrow gap. "Josiah, that you?" "Yeah, it's me. Listen, we ain't got much time. Guard's drunk again, but he won't stay that way long." Josiah's voice was different now, older somehow, hardened by 45 days of watching Emma suffer. "I got something for you. A knife. Small one but sharp. I'm gonna slide it under the door." Emma's breath caught. A knife. A weapon. But for what purpose? "Why?" she whispered. "Because in 5 days, Harlan's gonna come down to get you out. And I heard him talking to the master. They ain't planning on just releasing you. They gonna sell you south, Emma. Down to the sugar plantations in Louisiana where folks work till they drop dead. Say you too rebellious to keep on this plantation. Might inspire others." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. 55 days of suffering, and her reward was to be sold away to an even worse hell, separated from everyone she knew, sent to plantations where the mortality rate was so high they had to keep buying new slaves just to maintain numbers? "No," she breathed. They can't They can and they will, but I got a plan. Something slid under the door. A small knife, barely bigger than Emma's palm, wrapped in oilcloth to keep it from rusting. When Harlan comes to get you on day 55, you fight. Create a distraction. And we gonna be ready, and me, Big Moses, Tia Ruth, all of us who still got some fight left. We gonna help you run. Run where? Emma asked, her mind reeling. They got dogs, got paddy rollers, got men with guns. North, Josiah said firmly. We follow the drinking gourd like the old songs say. There's a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Man named Thomas runs a station about 20 miles from here. He helps freedom seekers get to the next stop. Tia Ruth knows how to find him. Emma held the knife in her trembling hands, feeling its weight, its potential. They'll kill you for this, she said. All of you. If you help me escape. They gonna kill us anyway, Emma. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but slavery kills everybody eventually. At least this way we die fighting for something. Josiah's voice was fierce, passionate. I've been in love with you since we was children, Emma. Been watching you suffer in that hole for 45 days and ain't been able to do nothing. Well, I can do something now. We all can. Tears streamed down Emma's face. Josiah, don't say nothing. Just be ready. When that door opens on day 55, you come out swinging. Stick that knife anywhere soft. His belly, his throat, don't matter. Just make him bleed enough that we can get you out while there's confusion. And then what? They'll hunt us. Put out notices. Set the dogs on our trail. Maybe, probably. But at least we'll be running toward freedom instead of waiting to die in chains. Josiah paused, and Emma heard the pain in his voice when he spoke again. I can't watch you get sold south, Emma. Can't stand by and let them take you away. Rather die trying to save you than live knowing I did nothing. Emma pressed her hand against the door, wishing she could touch him, could see his face one more time before everything went to hell. What about Tia Ruth? She barely survived the stocks, and Big Moses got a family. Everybody who's coming knows the risks, Josiah said. Tia Ruth say she rather die helping you escape than live one more day watching children suffer. Big Moses say his family gonna be better off knowing he died fighting than knowing he died broken. This ain't just about you, Emma. It's about all of us. About showing these devils that we ain't just property, that we're human beings willing to die for our freedom. Above them, a guard coughed, stirred. Josiah's voice dropped even lower. I got to go. 5 more days, Emma. 5 more days and then we run. You, me, whoever else got the courage to try. We follow the North Star. Find that conductor Thomas, make it to Pennsylvania or Canada, or wherever free black folks can live without chains. Josiah, wait. I love you, Emma. Been loving you since before I knew what love was. And I'm gonna get you out of that hole if it's the last thing I do. His footsteps retreated quickly, silently. Emma heard the guard mutter something. Heard Josiah's voice farther away now, casual-like. Just taking a piss, boss. That all right with you? The guard grumbled something unintelligible and settled back down. Emma clutched the knife to her chest, her mind racing. 5 days. 5 more days of darkness and pain. And then, what? Freedom or death? Both seemed equally likely, but Josiah was right. At least they'd die fighting. At least they'd make their own choice for once instead of having every decision made for them by masters and overseers. She unwrapped the knife and felt its edge, sharp enough to cut through flesh if she aimed right, sharp enough to give Harlan a surprise he wouldn't forget, assuming she survived long enough to use it. Emma had never hurt nobody in her life, never even thought about violence before. But 50 days in a dark hole changes a person. 50 days of salt and starvation and cruelty teaches you that sometimes the only way to survive is to fight back. Consequences be damned. She tested the knife's weight, practiced gripping it different ways, thought about where to strike for maximum damage. Throat, belly, eye. She didn't know much about killing, but desperation would make up for skill. 5 days. Emma whispered to the darkness, to the ancestors, to herself. 5 more days and then I either die free or live in chains. No in between. She hid the knife in the folds of her tattered shift, wrapped in the oilcloth to keep it from cutting her. Then she lay back down in her corner and closed her eyes, trying to rest, trying to build up whatever strength she had left. Because in 5 days she was going to need every bit of it. In 5 days, everything would change. In 5 days, Emma would discover if she had the courage to cut a man's throat and run for freedom, or if 50 days of suffering had broken something in her that couldn't be repaired. Above ground, the quarters buzzed with whispered plans and desperate hope. Josiah gathered the brave ones, the ones willing to risk everything for a child's freedom. Tia Ruth prepared herbs and supplies for the journey north. Big Moses stole rope and flint and anything that might help fugitives survive in the wilderness. And Harlan, ignorant of the rebellion brewing beneath his feet, counted down the days until he could parade Emma before the plantation as proof of his power, never suspecting that the half-dead child in the cellar was sharpening a blade and hardening her heart. 5 days to freedom, or death. Emma chose to believe in freedom. The ancestors, after all, had not brought her this far to let her die in chains. On the 54th night, Emma lay in the darkness, knowing it was her last night in this tomb. Tomorrow would bring day 55, the end of her sentence, and whatever hell or salvation waited beyond that cellar door. Sleep wouldn't come, couldn't come, not with tomorrow looming so large and terrifying. The knife was tucked against her hip, hidden but ready. She'd practiced grabbing it in the dark, practiced the motion of pulling it free and striking. Her hands knew what to do now, even if her heart wasn't sure it could follow through. Emma closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come right. What do you pray for when you're planning to kill a man come morning? What do you ask God for when you're about to either win freedom or die trying? The ancestors came to her then, not in fever dreams this time, but in something clearer. Iodel stood in the corner of the cellar, glowing faint like starlight, her tribal scars proud on her face. Tomorrow you become who you were always meant to be, the ancestor said, her voice like wind through trees. I'm scared, grandmother, Emma admitted. What if I freeze? What if I can't do it when the moment comes? Fear is not weakness, child. Fear is wisdom. Only fools charge into battle without fear. Iodel knelt beside Emma, and though she was just a spirit, Emma could almost feel her warmth. But you must not let fear paralyze you. When that door opens, when Harlan comes for you, your body will know what to do. The blood of warriors runs in your veins. Other spirits materialized around them. Emma's mama Sarah, looking younger and less heartbroken than Emma remembered. Her daddy Jacob, still strong-backed and proud. Slaves who died on this very plantation, their spirits still walking the quarters they'd worked in life. We're all with you, baby, Sarah said, her voice the one Emma remembered from childhood lullabies. Every ancestor who came before, every soul who suffered and died in chains, we all standing with you tomorrow. You ain't alone. They gonna hurt so many people because of me, Emma whispered. Josiah and Tia Ruth and Big Moses, they gonna suffer for helping me escape. They making their own choices, Jacob said, his voice firm. You ain't forcing them to nothing. They choosing freedom over safety, choosing courage over fear. That's the most human thing a body can do. Emma felt tears sliding down her face. I don't know if I can kill him, Harlan. I don't know if I got that in me. You don't have to be a killer, Iodel said. You just have to be desperate enough to survive. The knife is a tool like any other. Use it to carve your path to freedom, that's all. The spirits began to fade, but their presence lingered. Emma felt stronger somehow, more resolved. Tomorrow she would face Harlan for the last time, either as a slave being dragged to the auction block, or as a freedom seeker running toward the North Star. She wouldn't go quiet, wouldn't bow, wouldn't make it easy for them. Sleep finally came near dawn, light and fitful, full of dreams that mixed memory and prophecy. Emma saw herself running through Georgia woods, dogs barking behind her, the drinking gourd bright overhead. Saw Josiah falling, a bullet in his back, his blood soaking into red clay. Saw Tia Ruth hanging from a tree, punishment for aiding escape. Saw Big Moses fighting 3 white men with his bare hands while others ran past him toward freedom. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding. The visions might be prophecy or just fear. No way to know which until tomorrow became today and the future became present. Emma sat up in the darkness and felt her back. The storm's cleansing had worked miracles. The infections were mostly gone. The flesh starting to heal properly for the first time in 54 days. She was still painfully thin, still weak from starvation, but she was alive. Stronger than she'd been in weeks. Strong enough to fight, strong enough to run. Above her, she heard the plantation stirring. The work bell would ring soon, calling slaves to another day of labor. But Emma's labor was almost done. 54 days in the darkness, and tomorrow the light would return, one way or another. She touched the knife again, drew comfort from its weight. This small blade represented possibility, choice, agency. For 54 days, she'd had no control over anything. Tomorrow, she'd take that control back with sharpened steel. "I'm ready," Emma whispered to the darkness, to the ancestors, to herself. "Whatever comes tomorrow, I'm ready." The plantation bell rang, harsh and metallic. The last morning bell Emma would hear from inside this tomb. Tomorrow night, she'd either be dead, or she'd be running north under stars that promised freedom. Emma stood up, testing her legs. They held, weak, but functional. She stretched carefully, felt her scarred back pull and ache but not tear. She was as ready as she'd ever be. The bolt on the door scraped. Emma's heart jumped. Was it already day 55? Had she lost track of time? But no, it was just the guard checking on her, like they did every few days now since the doctor's visit. The door opened a crack, lamplight stabbing in. "Still breathing down there, girl?" the guard called. "Still breathing," Emma answered, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. The guard grunted and closed the door. The bolt scraped home. Emma smiled in the darkness. She'd sounded strong just then. Sounded like someone who wouldn't be easy to break or sell or kill. Good. Let them think she was defeated. Let Harlan believe 54 days had crushed her spirit. Tomorrow he'd learn different. Emma settled back into her corner and began to plan. When Harlan opened the door, she'd be ready. When he came down the ladder, knife hidden, waiting for the perfect moment. One chance, that's all she'd get. One strike had to make it count. She practiced the motion again in the dark. Reach, grab, pull, strike. Reach, grab, pull, strike. Over and over until her hands knew it by heart. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Emma counted heartbeats, counted breaths, counted minutes. Twilight came. Night fell. And somewhere above, Josiah and Tia Ruth and Big Moses and all the others who'd chosen courage over safety made their own preparations, stole food for the journey, gathered supplies, whispered prayers, made peace with the possibility of death. Tomorrow the rebellion would begin. Tomorrow, Emma would either carve her name in history as a freedom seeker who chose dignity over chains, or she'd die trying. Either way, she'd face it with a knife in her hand and fire in her heart. The ancestors demanded nothing less. One more night in the darkness, then dawn, then freedom or death. Emma closed her eyes and waited for day 55 to arrive, knowing it would be the most important day of her short life, and knowing, deep in her bones, that she was ready for whatever it brought. The dawn of the 55th day broke over the Wexford plantation, with a sky the color of blood and gold, like the heavens themselves knew something terrible and beautiful was about to be born. Emma heard the work bell ring and knew her time had come. She stood in the center of the cellar, knife hidden in her palm, wrapped tight in the oilcloth. Her heart hammered like African drums, but her hands were steady. 54 days of suffering had burned away everything soft in her, leaving only iron will and desperate courage. The bolt scraped back. The door opened. Light flooded in, and Emma saw Harlan's silhouette at the top of the ladder, backlit by the rising sun. "Well, well," his voice came down, thick with satisfaction. 55 days. You made it, girl. Can't say I'm pleased about that, but a deal's a deal." He started descending the ladder. "Time to come out and face your new fate. Master found a buyer down in Louisiana who pays premium for rebellious slaves. Says he can break anyone within a month." Emma said nothing, just watched him come closer, step by step, her breathing slow and controlled. The knife felt hot in her hand, like it was alive, eager. Harlan reached the bottom of the ladder and turned to face her. His eyes widened when he saw her standing upright, saw the fire still burning in her gaze despite 55 days of hell. "You still got some fight in you? Good. They like 'em spirited in Louisiana. More fun to break." He reached for her arm and Emma moved. 55 days of planning, of practicing in the dark, of hardening her heart against mercy. It all came together in one fluid motion. She pulled the knife free, the oilcloth falling away, and drove the blade straight into Harlan's belly. The overseer's eyes went wide with shock. He looked down at the knife protruding from his gut, looked back up at Emma's face, and saw something there that terrified him more than the blade. Absolute resolution. "That's for every child you ever hurt," Emma hissed. "Every soul you ever broke, every life you stole." She twisted the knife and pulled it free. Harlan staggered backward, his hands clutching his bleeding stomach, his mouth opening to scream. But Emma was already moving past him, scrambling up the ladder faster than her weakened body should have allowed, propelled by pure adrenaline and the ancestors' strength flowing through her blood. She burst out of the cellar into blinding sunlight. The world spun, too bright, too loud, too much after 55 days of darkness. But there was no time to adjust. Harlan was screaming below and guards would come running. "Now!" a voice shouted. Josiah, emerging from behind the barn with Big Moses and 3 other men Emma barely recognized. "Run, Emma! North, we'll hold them off!" The plantation erupted in chaos. Slaves who'd been heading to the field stopped and stared. Some ran toward the commotion. Others ran away from it. And some, the brave ones, the desperate ones, ran toward freedom. Emma's legs felt like water, but she forced them to move. One step, then another, then running. Behind her she heard gunshots, screams, the sound of fighting. Josiah's voice shouting defiance. Big Moses roaring like a bear as he fought off guards. "This way!" Tia Ruth appeared from the side, moving surprisingly fast for a woman so recently broken. "Into the woods, child! Follow me!" They ran together, Emma and Tia Ruth and a handful of others who'd chosen this moment to make their bid for freedom. Behind them, the plantation descended into chaos, overseers shouting orders, dogs barking, the master himself emerging from the big house demanding to know what in hell was happening. Emma glanced back once and saw Josiah fighting 3 men at once, a stolen knife in his hand, blood running down his face. Their eyes met across the distance and he smiled, actually smiled, before disappearing under a pile of guards. "Don't look back," Tia Ruth gasped, pulling Emma forward. "He chose his path, now you choose yours." They plunged into the Georgia woods, thick with pine and oak, and the morning mist still clinging to the ground. Behind them came the sound of pursuit, dogs baying, men shouting, horses being saddled. But the woods belonged to those who knew them, and Tia Ruth had been planning this escape for days. She led them through a creek to throw off the dog's scent, then up a rocky hillside where horses couldn't follow. Other escaped slaves joined them. Samuel trying to redeem himself, young Clara with her 2 children, an old man named Isaiah who'd been waiting 40 years for this chance. They ran until Emma's lungs burned and her legs gave out. Tia Ruth let her rest for 5 minutes, no more. Then they were moving again, always north, always following the drinking gourd like the spirituals taught. By nightfall, they'd covered maybe 10 miles. Not enough, never enough. But they'd made it to the first safe house, a root cellar beneath a free black family's farm, where conductor Thomas waited with food and water and news. "Harlan survived," Thomas told them grimly. "And he's put up a reward for you, girl. $200 for your capture. They're saying you tried to murder him in cold blood." "I succeeded in stabbing him," Emma corrected, her voice hard. "Only thing cold-blooded was what he did to me for 55 days. Thomas studied her, this thin, scarred child with eyes that had seen too much darkness. "You got fire in you. Good, you'll need it. Journey to freedom is long and dangerous, and they'll be hunting you hard." "Let them hunt," Emma said. "I survived 55 days in hell. I can survive anything." They rested that night in the safe house, and Emma learned that Big Moses had been killed in the fighting. His body beaten so badly they couldn't identify him proper. Josiah was in chains, awaiting public whipping as an example to other slaves. 3 guards had been injured, and Harlan was in his bed with the plantation doctor trying to keep infection from the knife wound from killing him. Emma wept for Big Moses, for Josiah, for everyone who'd sacrificed so she could run. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Their sacrifice demanded she keep going, keep fighting, keep running north until she crossed into free territory. The journey took 3 months. 3 months of hiding in barns and cellars and swamps. 3 months of near captures and close calls. 3 months of following the North Star through Maryland, Pennsylvania, into New York. Emma lost 2 toes to frostbite, nearly drowned crossing a river, and saw more cruelty from slave catchers than she'd thought possible. But she also saw kindness, saw free black communities that risked everything to shelter runaways, saw white abolitionists who believed slavery was sin, saw the Underground Railroad in action, that network of courage and defiance stretching from the Deep South to Canada. Tia Ruth made it as far as Pennsylvania before her heart gave out, worn down by years of suffering and the hard journey north. She died in Emma's arms, smiling, whispering, "We made it, child. We made it to free soil." Emma buried her in a place where the sun shone warm, and no overseer's whip could ever reach her again. On a cold December morning, Emma crossed into Canada. She stood on free soil for the first time in her life, looked back south toward the Georgia plantation, where she'd suffered 55 days in darkness, and felt something break loose in her chest. She was free, scarred, damaged, haunted by nightmares and memories, but free. Emma settled in a black community near Toronto, worked as a seamstress, learned to read and write. She never forgot the 55 days, never forgot Josiah or Big Moses or Tia Ruth, or any of the souls who'd paid for her freedom with their blood. She became a conductor herself on the Underground Railroad, helping other freedom seekers make the journey she'd made. Told her story to anyone who'd listen, bearing witness to slavery's cruelty so the world couldn't pretend it didn't know. And every night before she slept, Emma touched the scars on her back, those permanent reminders of salt and darkness, and whispered the same prayer. I survived. For Big Moses who died fighting, for Josiah who gave everything, for Tia Ruth who showed me kindness when the world showed only cruelty, for my mama and daddy sold away, for Iodele who crossed the terrible ocean, for all the ancestors who suffered so I could be free. I survived, and I'll make sure their sacrifice meant something. I'll make sure the world remembers. Years later, when the war finally came and slavery crumbled under the weight of its own evil, Emma stood among the newly freed and wept. She was an old woman by then, her hair gray, her body bent from hard years. But the fire that had sustained her through 55 days of darkness still burned bright. She returned to Georgia once, found the Wexford plantation abandoned and overgrown, found the cellar where she'd suffered, now just a hole in the ground filled with leaves and time. She stood at its edge and spoke to the ghosts that lingered there. I kept my promise, she said. I survived. I fought. I freed others. And I'm telling your story so the world can't forget, so children will know what their ancestors endured, so the salt and the darkness and the suffering won't be erased from history. Emma lived to be 73 years old, died in her sleep, free, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew her story and would carry it forward. And folks say that in her final moments she smiled because she saw them waiting. Josiah and Tia Ruth and Big Moses and all the ancestors, standing in light so bright it made the sun look dim. We've been waiting for you, Iodele said, taking Emma's hand. Come home, child. You've earned your rest. And Emma, who'd survived 55 days when survival seemed impossible, who'd carved freedom from slavery's iron grip, who'd transformed suffering into resistance and pain into purpose, finally laid down her burden and walked into the light. Now listen close, children of the diaspora, as I close this testimony of suffering and survival. Emma's story ain't just about one girl in one cellar. It's about every soul who endured the unendurable, who survived when death seemed kinder, who chose freedom over safety and dignity over chains. The salt burned. Yes, it did. The darkness crushed. The cruelty seemed endless. But the human spirit, when properly motivated by love and resistance and the ancestors' strength, can survive anything. Those 55 days in the cellar weren't the end of Emma's story. They were the beginning. The beginning of a life lived in defiance of those who tried to break her. The beginning of a legacy of resistance that would inspire generations. So when you feel like the darkness is too heavy, when the salt burns too deep, when you don't think you can survive one more day, remember Emma. Remember that girl who stood up when everything said stay down. Remember that child who looked at evil and refused to bow. Her scars are your inheritance. Her courage is your birthright. Her survival is your testimony. Who suffered, suffered. Who resisted, left memory, and memory we keep here in the echoes from the quarters. So the salt can't silence us. So the darkness can't erase us. So our children's children will know. We survived. We fought. We won. And we still here, still standing, still echoing through time, loud and clear and unbreakable. Amen, and may the ancestors rest in power.